No.
Starting. Here we go.
All right. Good morning, Dr. Dalal. Thank you so much for joining me today to talk about industrial organizational psychology and insider threat. You are one of the very, very few IO psychologists who has even paused for half a millisecond to think about this topic. So before we dive into the questions that I have today, for you, I was hoping that you could give us a little bit more about who you are, your background, what you do, all of that basic kind of introductory stuff.
Sure. So, well, thank you for having me, first of all. I'm a professor of industrial and organizational psychology, or IO psychology as we abbreviate it, at George Mason University, which is in Fairfax, Virginia, a suburb of Washington, D.C. And how did I get into this field? Well, that's complicated. I'm originally from India, and so I planned to go to med school. Then I thought about going to law school, and I ended up in psychology just by happenstance. I took an intro psych course, just fell in love with the field, and eventually ended up going to a PhD program, but in social psychology, got my master's, and then was like, this is not really for me. So switched to industrial organizational, which fortunately, at the University of Illinois, where I got my PhD, was very close in terms of affiliation to social psychology. So it was an easy switch. So that's how I ended up where I did. And I've been here ever since. I had my first academic job at Purdue University in Indiana, and then moved to George Mason for two reasons. One is George Mason has a really good IO program. And the second is I was trying to be in the same location as my then fiance, now wife. So that's how we ended up here. So, yep.
Oh, that is wonderful. What do you typically, study and think about?
So I have the problem of being interested in too many things, and
me too.
It's a really bad idea. Don't do it, because on the one hand, there are some advantages of being sort of a jack of all trades. It has helped me, for instance, in my cybersecurity work, which we'll talk about in a bit. But it's difficult because every time you start in a new area, you have to read up on and sort of master all the stuff that's already been done. There are all of these sort of unique blind spots that you might not know about, different keywords when you're searching the literature that may not have occurred to you. And so you may miss a lot of stuff that's been done, and your research may therefore be a little more uninformed than it could otherwise have been. So, what I would argue is it's better to find a couple of areas that you really like and then explore the heck out of them.
Are you going to start doing that?
No.
Me neither.
It's too late for me now, but I'm hoping that other people don't repeat my mistakes.
It may be a confusing life, but it is a joyful life to be a bit scattered.
Yes.
So how did you, so I guess first of all, actually, let's start here because this flows really nicely from what you just said. So you're interested in all of these different things. You kind of like to dibble and dabble, if one would say. How did you get specifically into insider threat work as an industrial organizational psychologist?
So that was also really just fortuitous. Folks were looking for people to join on an application for a massive contract for funding from the US Department of Homeland Security. And they contacted George Mason and said, you have these people called IO psychologists. We don't really know what they are, but can you recommend somebody who's good? And so I said, well, I'll certainly attend a meeting, but I don't know anything about cybersecurity. But at the meeting, they sort of set my mind at ease. And it wasn't only me, by the way, it was a couple of colleagues and me. So there were three of us involved in this, three IO psychologists from George Mason. And they basically said, look, you don't really need to know anything about the technical aspects of cybersecurity. One big problem in cybersecurity is the human is the weakest link. The technology is often in better shape than the humans. So when you talk about humans in cybersecurity, you talk about two different types of, well, humans, and because we're IO psychologists, we study employees. So two different types of employees. The first is the type of employee whose job is a cybersecurity focused job. So if you work for a large company, you may not know this, but there is probably what's called a cybersecurity incident response team or a security operations center. And there are employees who staff those teams, or really they're not teams, they're what's called multi-team systems. And so that's sort of one subcategory of employee we can study. But the other subcategory is every employee. And this starts to get to insider threat. Every employee in a company who interacts in any capacity with information communication technology, computers, the organization's computer networks and so forth, is responsible to some extent for cybersecurity. And the person can do a better job or a worse job, and that's where we get into insider threat.
So, which leads beautifully into, how do you define insider threat, or how do you think about insider threat?
Right. So when you think about cybersecurity, for folks who are just getting into cybersecurity, you tend to think of a company getting hacked from outside. And so you tend to think of these sort of attackers. That's the actual terminology used in the field. Some of the terminology for me as an IO psychologist was very interesting, because it's a little different from our terminology.
You say, whoa, this is loaded.
Exactly, right? Like they're not kidding around here. You got like attackers and defenders, and you got black hats and white hats, and
okay.
teaming, blue team. I was like, whoa. You tend to think of folks attacking the company's networks from outside. And that's true to an extent, but what's also true is that often a lot of cybersecurity incidents are caused by insiders, employees essentially, or they could in some senses be folks who are not employees but still work within the organization's computer networks. So vendors, customers, people like that, who are still in some senses connected to the organization. But these insiders can, do things that are sloppy. So for example, they can, forget to change their passwords, or a very common thing is they can receive a suspicious email and they can click on a link. So that's called a phishing attack, Phishing, not F. And the phishing example is interesting because it requires both an outsider who sends the phishing email and an insider who inadvertently clicks on it. So that's a combination of outsider and insider. And then you sometimes have malicious insiders. So what we IO psychologists would call somebody who's dissatisfied with his or her job, or what the cybersecurity folks would call a, quote, disgruntled employee, unquote. And so these folks might be acting from within to sabotage the company's network. So you have different motivations, and in some cases the behavior can be inadvertent or deliberate. And that's actually an interesting issue, because in the insider threat literature, depending on whom you ask, inadvertent or accidental behavior either is or is not characterized as insider threat behavior, whereas sort of deliberate malicious behavior is always classified as insider threat behavior.
Okay, that's messy.
It's messy, but interestingly enough, it closely parallels the completely independent IO psychology literature on counterproductive or deviant behavior. So we also have trouble definitionally with accidental behavior. We don't know what to do with it. And generally, we also don't characterize it as counterproductive or deviant behavior. We study it very differently. We study it in terms of safety and security rather than sort of malicious intent and malicious outcomes. bad outcomes, essentially. So it's an odd parallel because the two fields develop pretty much independently of each other.
That's fascinating. So this is, I'm wondering, is that because in part we're kind of defining these constructs almost based on their outcome rather than the behavior? So it's sort of, it muddies it because we're almost confounding these two components, right? The behavior itself and the outcome, whereas different behaviors are leading to the same outcome.
I would go even further than that and say we're confounding three things. We're confounding, yes, the outcomes and the behaviors, but we're also confounding the antecedents. So the reason, the motivations for engaging in the behavior.
Sure.
And I think that problem exists both in cybersecurity and in industrial organizational psychology. It's just interesting to see that parallel.
Okay, so I guess I don't know if I want to jump all the way here, but that's going to be a question, right? What do we do about that? How should we approach things? Let's get to that at the end of this, because I think that the natural flow here, since you started talking about things like counterproductive work behaviors and dissatisfied employees, is, what do we know about the people, either intentionally or unintentionally, who might be more of a risk factor in terms of, I don't know if the right term is becoming an insider threat or like,
right.
What do we know about those people?
Yeah, so, again, when we think as IO psychologists, we approach a new field like cybersecurity, we might at first, feel a little daunted that, what do I know about this field? I feel like an imposter. I don't really know anything about the technical aspects. Well, first of all, over time, you pick up a little bit about the technical aspects, and it is important to do so that you know what you're talking about. But it's also important to realize that, again, these are employees, and we know a lot about employees as IO psychologists. So, let's break it down and look at different aspects. First of all, we know a lot about the characteristics of employees. So things like their job attitudes, their personality traits, their demographic characteristics. Then we know a lot about job performance. So how they complete their core tasks that are written on their job description, but also things like counterproductive or deviant behavior. And then on the flip side, what's called organizational citizenship behavior. So helping, volunteering, things like that. And then moving one level up from the employee, we know a lot about teams. And in IO, we are starting to know more about what's called multi-team systems, which are teams interacting with other teams as part of a broader system. So we know a lot about employees. And one way of looking at this is that we are applying that to a particular domain. So let me just give you one example of, an area where IO psychology can make a difference, hopefully. In the cybersecurity literature, there has been some work on the relationship between age, employee age, and insider threat behavior on the part of these employees. And so what they find, first of all, is a very weak relationship, and a relationship that, if anything, suggests that older employees engage in more insider threat than younger employees. And this might sound a little surprising at first for a couple of reasons. One is that in terms of technology, we tend to think of younger employees as being so-called digital natives, as in they've grown up with technology, whereas older employees are, digital tourists or whatever you want to call them, that they are sort of learning, they're less familiar with technology. But we also know from the IO literature that although there isn't a strong relationship with age, most counterproductive or deviant behavior tends to be performed by younger people, young adults, especially young men. They know this in the criminology literature as well. I mean, there's a saying that, crime is a young man's phenomenon. Basically, a disproportionate amount of crime is perpetrated by young men. So why don't we see this in the cybersecurity literature? Why do we see a very weak relationship, if anything, a trend in the opposite direction? Well, there are a couple of reasons. And one is that IO psychologists can really contribute to how we study this phenomenon. if you look at the existing cybersecurity studies, you see a couple of things. You see, first of all, that there's what we would call, as a technical term, range restriction in age. In other words, they typically study only a pretty narrow age band. So if you restrict the range or variance in a variable, it's not going to really be able to relate just mathematically to anything else because you've already compressed the range. So you got to study a much broader range of age. That's one of the huge problems. Related to that, they also tend to study a pretty narrow range of expertise. For example, if you're studying only undergrads, you've got a restricted age range, something like 17 to 22 for the most part, unless you have mature students. But you also have a restriction of range and expertise to be able to perpetrate these types of insider threat behaviors. So as IO psychologists, we can suggest better research designs to study some of these similar problems, if that makes sense.
So methodological issues is part of the fundamental problem why we don't know as much as we might about the people who are potentially risks. Probably also low occurrence for some of the behaviors.
That's absolutely right. So, and we have that problem in IO as well. Some of the very severe counterproductive or deviant behaviors, whether insider threat focused or otherwise, are very low base rate behaviors. And so they're very rare and they're hard to study. Yep.
Becomes a lot harder to actually predict when you're only predicting a handful of cases.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, you mentioned multi-team systems a couple of times now. Yep. Let's go up to the next level. What do we know about the kinds of organizations that might be at a greater risk for insider threat?
Yeah, so when we think about organizations, it's, you can again unpack it at different levels. So first of all, at the organization level itself, you can think about things like cultures and climates. So in that regard, to what extent does the organization really focus on cybersecurity? And, again, here, keep in mind, we're not necessarily just talking about information technology firms. We're talking about pretty much every firm that uses computers and computer networks. So that's almost every firm. And so there's a wide range in the extent to which upper management is knowledgeable about, cares about, does things to promote cybersecurity. So that's one thing, cultures or climates, and related to that is policies and procedures. And so then another aspect is training, cybersecurity training. Unfortunately, this isn't the positive spin on cybersecurity training is that this is a very interesting area for research and an area where I think IO psychologists can contribute. Cybersecurity folks themselves are concerned, rightly in my view, that a lot of the cybersecurity training is really focused on ensuring compliance rather than actually mitigating cybersecurity risk. So if I'm in charge of cybersecurity training for an organization, unfortunately, my motivation might be, can I ensure that everybody who's supposed to take the training has taken the training? So if we get sued, I can point to this and say, like, everybody has been trained. So it's not my fault. Don't blame me, right? We've complied with all of these federal regulations and so forth. Okay, great. But to what extent have we actually mitigated cybersecurity risk? That is a different issue. By the way, just to be clear, I think that attitude is also prevalent in a lot of IO training. So for example,
I was going to say diversity, equity, and inclusion was the immediate thing that came to my mind. It's the same thing.
Yes.
It's let's cover ourselves, not necessarily what is it that we're going to do to truly drive change within the organization. And to your point, it comes back to policies, practices, and procedures, because training at most will increase your knowledge, but it doesn't mean it changes behavior.
Exactly. So you took the words right out of my mouth.
My bad.
No, it's perfect. I'm glad that I was sort of advertising where I was going or signaling. I think it's a big problem in, we don't really know how effective diversity training is. And, unfortunately, some of the research suggests it's not all that effective. So we've got a huge problem We're not tackling it in an effective way. I would say even, other related areas like sexual harassment prevention training, you've got the same thing. And going even further, actual sort of physical safety training. We often, again, inadvertently adopt this sort of compliance mindset rather than saying like, okay, we've got safety training. Is it actually reducing the number of injuries and accidents? Or we've got sexual harassment prevention training. Sure, as you said, people are more knowledgeable now about what sexual harassment is, what they should and shouldn't be doing, but are they actually not doing what they shouldn't be doing? We often don't study it, and when we study it, the results are often disappointing. You see the same thing with insider threat training. In fact, there's a very interesting concern in the insiders in the cybersecurity training area that, again, also I would say is equally applicable to IO. You alluded to this actually just a minute ago. Training should improve knowledge, skills, and abilities, let alone behavior. But maybe it's the case that we're not even getting to knowledge, skills, and abilities. We're just getting to risk tolerance. So, for example, a lot of the cybersecurity training will do things like show you, here's an email that's just come in. What should you be looking at to determine, is this a suspicious email or not? Or when you go to a website, what are the properties of the website? Like, does it have HTTPS? Does it have the little lock symbol? Things like that. Those are little things you should be looking for. What seems to be the case is that when people are trained, they just become more cautious. They don't necessarily become more knowledgeable. So in other words, they may become more suspicious about every email or every website rather than knowing how to discern which email is suspicious and which one is not. So that's not necessarily what we're trying to do, and that's a problem.
So if we think about like models of perception, right? What you're basically saying is they're not improving their discrimination, their ability to discriminate between stimuli. Right. They're just shifting their threshold.
That's right. Exactly. So we often don't study this in IO psychology, but other areas of psychology like human factors study what's called signal detection theory.
I was actually about to bring up signal detection theory. I was like, should I? Should we get there? Yes. Yeah, we should.
We should, absolutely. Let's do it. So, what we should be maximizing are the true signal, like when a threat is present, that we actually respond correctly to it. And when a threat is absent, we also correctly respond to the absence of the threat. But we have these two types of errors. When a threat is present, we may fail to respond to it, or when a threat is absent, we may nonetheless respond as though there were a threat. So we're not really training for discrimination. We're just, as you say, changing the threshold, which in some cases is good when there is a malicious email, but in perhaps most cases, most emails are not malicious, is bad. And so people are then just, taking more time to go through email. Email's already a time sink, right? And people are just getting stressed out. Like, am I going to get phished? So, it's not great.
So part of that, of course, is understanding the base rate of that phenomenon. Like, how frequently are you going to get phished? But part of that is also, my thought is, as we're talking, that we have prioritized one type of accuracy so much as to completely sacrifice the other form of accuracy. So we've made that not a priority. So changing the threshold actually is a really effective technique when you've been told that you only have to care about one kind of accuracy.
That's right. That's right.
From an individual perspective, it may not be ideal from an organizational perspective, but from an individual decision-making perspective, that's an efficient way of making decisions now, even if you're stressed.
Yeah. So to go back to your original question, what can organizations do? At the organization level, we've talked about culture, climate, we've talked about policies, procedures, we've talked about training that the organization implements. That's all at the organization level. But then also, again, the people make the place. So selecting, right, as a
I was gonna say, I'm from UMD, so you already know, like, that's my mantra.
Exactly, right. We're on familiar terrain here. So it's important to select employees carefully. There's a fair amount of research in IO that suggests that even things like job satisfaction have a dispositional component.
Yeah.
So, I want to be very careful in my wording here so I don't come across as blaming the victim, because that is not my intent. The research does suggest, however, that certain people are likely to be dissatisfied to some extent, regardless of the characteristics of the job. So they, essentially they'll be dissatisfied in whatever job they're in. Others will be more likely to be satisfied in whatever job they're in. So, there are those individual characteristics. We do need to take those into account, but also we need to treat people fairly. We need to give them opportunities for advancement and things like that. So there's a lot that organizations can do. And frankly, it's not rocket science. It's what we talk about in IO all day, right?
Right. So like organizational justice, so different types of procedural justice, distributive justice, issues related to performance management, of course, holding people accountable, all of that good stuff. Yeah.
Yep.
Wonderful. So what does, and you've kind of already gone into this a little bit, but crystallizing, what is it that industrial organizational psychology adds to the study of insider threat?
So we can contribute a lot with regard to the human aspects of insider threat, especially the employee-focused aspects. That's not to say that there aren't other fields that can contribute a lot to the human side. So again, human factors psychology can contribute a lot. One area where I think IO psychologists have really missed the boat is on human computer, or more broadly human technology interaction, where human factor psychologists have done much better. And an example of that is the literature on trust. So trust, the sort of original seminal work was conducted in IO psychology. And of course, it is a huge area of research still within IO psychology, but human factors folks saw this original work and said, hey, there's this entirely new area that's coming up on human computer or human technology interaction.
Yep.
And so, as jobs are changing, being redesigned, technology is increasing, how do we determine when and under what circumstances the humans, the employees, will trust technology? And so they've adapted some of the fundamental measures that we used in IO psychology to human technology, human computer interaction, trust and automation, things like that. And we've really missed the boat in IO. They've eaten our lunch. So it's a shame, but I think we really need to get back to studying that, probably in collaboration with human factors psychologists. Also, folks in information systems marketing and so forth will talk about the consumer aspects of cybersecurity. So that's not necessary. That's now getting outside the insider threat aspects. But if you are a consumer, your credit card information and personal information is almost certainly on a gazillion computer networks, and if they get hacked, then you're kind of screwed. We wrote a recent paper on cybersecurity, just sort of an overview from an IO perspective. And we started the paper by just giving examples of massive computer breaches. And while we were writing the paper, we had to update that, those first few paragraphs a few times, because there were all these big new breaches. And it's like, oh, well, my own information has been hacked in, this breach, that breach, etc. So there are certainly non-IO components to cybersecurity that IO psychologists should know about, because they're also part of the human part, but they're a little bit outside our realm.
Well, let's go right there then. What can cybersecurity add to our knowledge of industrial organizational psychology?
Quite a bit, actually. So you can think of that question in two ways. One way is the sort of super practical that cybersecurity offers kind of a new domain or a test bed for some of our ideas. So let me just give you one example there. We IO psychologists are very interested in studying employee performance, right? What does it mean to be an employee who performs well versus not so well, and so forth? Well, if we look at cybersecurity, there are a lot. Oh, so one of the problems we have is in IO is generating sort of objective, quote unquote, objective measures of performance. We can ask employees, how well are you performing? And they'll give you answers that, are somewhat useful, but they're also full of biases. Yeah. We can ask their supervisors or coworkers how well they're performing. And although we tend to set more store in those types of what are called other ratings rather than self ratings of performance, there are also lots of problems with those other ratings. So for example, for counterproductive or deviant behavior, a lot of this behavior is covert.
Yeah, you can't see it.
Your supervisor is not going to find out about this. So if you ask your supervisor about counterproductive work behavior, you're not going to get great answers. In the cybersecurity world, you have a lot of data, performance-related data that are collected just automatically by the information communication technology network. So for example, let's say I get an email saying, Reeshad, please be sure to change your password by like X date. Do I actually change my password, or do they sort of lock me out until I reluctantly change my password? When I change my password, do I just like change one letter or one number, or do I make it a completely different password? Those types of things are collected automatically. And you can get data through that on what people are doing. For more cybersecurity focused employees, those who are working in security operations centers, for example, these analysts are basically trying to mitigate cybersecurity incidents that are occurring to the organization. And so you can get a ton of information about their performance. How many incidents did they handle in the average day? What was the average difficulty of these incidents? How successfully were these incidents remediated? Did they have to call for help, et cetera? So, you can get a lot of objective information about their performance. So this is just an example of how, from a practical standpoint, cybersecurity kind of offers a good test bed and can provide us good data in some senses. If you're studying multi-team systems, that's another example. Cybersecurity is a good area. But there's a whole other way in which cybersecurity can benefit IO, and that is at a more kind of basic fundamental level. To my mind, it forces us to examine some of our unexamined assumptions, and that's a very useful thing to do. So I gave you the example already of training. Does it actually improve knowledge, skills, and abilities, or just change your risk tolerance? That's something that I don't think we were focusing on in IO, but we should be. Another example, counterproductive or deviant behavior, so close to insider threat. We in IO tended to assume that counterproductive work behavior is influenced by a person's personality, job attitudes, and so forth, but not so much the person's knowledge, skill, abilities, technical expertise, things like that. Mm-hmm. And if you're going to enact malicious insider threat behaviors from a cybersecurity standpoint, you really need to understand the company's networks. You need to understand when are you going to have the opportunity to perpetrate this with less risk of being detected, things like that. So it requires considerable technical expertise. And if you start thinking along those lines, you start realizing that that's probably true in a variety of fields. So sophisticated financial crimes perpetrated by employees require a lot of expertise. And there are certainly other areas like that. So maybe we've been missing out on the subset of more technologically demanding counterproductive or deviant behaviors. That's interesting. One last example is we tend to study employee behavior or team behavior in IO psychology. But what we don't study is when a particular problem occurs, it starts being handled by an employee, and the employee realizes that he or she needs help, and so brings in other people. So we tend to study teams that already exist, or what are called intact teams. Yeah. We don't study team formation on the fly. We don't study events that trigger the need for collaboration among employees. And I think that is another blind spot that we have had that we should start to address.
So if we did more on social network analysis, for example, would let us
Not
get
just
at
social
that.
network analysis. We do study social networks, but we don't study
a little bit.
social networks. I agree a little bit.
A little bit.
but this is a specific subset. This is the
You're talking about the formation of it.
Or perhaps formation is wrong, or maybe the utilization. Under what circumstances do I activate my social network to address a specific problem? We don't see that at all. Really.
Yeah. So which gets to emergence, which we don't do just quite as much. And I know you talk about multi-team systems, so we are talking about, issues of emergence and then disintegration as needed when the task is done. But we so often look at these linear relationships kind of at one point in time or at a handful of points in time. Makes it a lot harder to capture and track dynamic processes. Absolutely. So random question, in your opinion, which I don't know if this is something that you've given thought to or not, so feel free to be like, I have no idea. Why technology's been a thing for a minute now, like not a couple of years, not a couple of decades. It's been around, it's been trucking along. So why haven't industrial organizational psychology and the field of cybersecurity kind of come together before now? Why are we having this conversation now and saying, hey, these two fields should really come together more? Why haven't they?
It's a good question. I think in part it deals with just disciplinary training. We just haven't been trained in those areas. And so it's just hard to speak each other's language. The same term can mean something very different. So for example, when you talk about coding, cybersecurity folks would talk about, writing, computer software code. We often would think about qualitative research and where indicating whether particular behaviors occurred or not. So that's an example. Another example, to use one that you just used, is networks. They tend to use the word network in terms of computer networks. We tend to use the word network in terms of social networks. Of course, they're both important networks, and we should be studying how social and computer networks interact. But it's just hard, technology-wise. When we were doing this work, our contract was about 4 years long. And for the first 1.5 to 2 years, I really felt as though, I was just treading water. I was just learning about cybersecurity, just trying to figure out where can I add value, and just, feeling like a bit of an imposter. It took me a while to learn enough to basically say, okay, yes, we definitely can contribute. I will say that the cybersecurity folks were very welcoming. They all, at least the ones we talked to, at least to my face, expressed, certainly willingness to listen to psychology perspectives. They all agreed that, or volunteered themselves, that the human was sort of the weakest link in the chain, and that technological solutions were helpful, but not sufficient. So I think we just have to try. And conversely, on the cybersecurity side, I think they have to recognize that even though we are a soft science, we can add a little bit of value.
Yeah, a little bit. So let's say you're starting to learn about insider threat and you don't have a psychology background at all. You've never taken a single psychology class. What would you say are some of the key concepts or theories from psychology that would be important for somebody to learn who is coming into the field of insider threat with absolutely no psychology background?
Yeah, from a psychology standpoint, or an IO psychology standpoint in particular, I would say study, essentially the topics that you cover in an introductory IO course at the undergrad level, but then you would probably want to do a little more reading on some of these topics. So you'd want to study employee performance, things like counterproductive or deviant behavior. You would want to study employee personality, employee job attitudes, organizational justice perceptions, teams, multi-team systems. So all the stuff we've talked about. I know that's not very helpful just saying study all of these topics, but I think many of them do have something to add.
Yeah. So what's next for IO and insider threat? Where do we go from here?
Well, it's a good question. I think there are a few directions. One is the one that I'm taking, but keep in mind that I have, a very specific niche, which is that I'm a researcher. And even more so, I'm interested in doing sort of more basic or fundamental research. I'm happy to some extent to do kind of traditional IO research in the cybersecurity domain, just sort of applying it to that domain. But I'm more interested in, what sort of fundamental breakthroughs can IO make in cybersecurity, and perhaps even more so, what can cybersecurity really teach us in IO that opens our eyes and makes us do research differently. So I'm interested in mostly publishing in research-focused peer-reviewed journals. To that end, I alluded to this a few minutes ago, we've just published a paper that is kind of a broad survey of areas where we think IO can contribute to cybersecurity research and cybersecurity can contribute to IO research. We're following that up with a call for papers for a special issue of the Journal of Business and Psychology, where we hope that people will take us up on this and will submit papers at the intersection of IO and cybersecurity research. So that's sort of the research-focused answer to your question. But of course, there's a lot of practice and application that can occur. So when I look around, one of the most common things I see is that a lot of IO consulting firms are focusing on how to select cybersecurity employees. And so as a part of that, they are conducting job analyses for cybersecurity focused employees. They're developing selection tests. They are then validating them. And that's important work. But I think we could also do other things, like, again, focus more on training. What can IO contribute to training and performance management and so forth? So we're starting, but baby steps in both the research and practice areas.
That's awesome. Dr. Dalal, thank you so much for giving me so much of your time today to talk about IO, cybersecurity, and insider threat. Really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Of course.